The readings for Sunday, October 23rd. The Matins Gospel reading for today comes from the book of John, chapter 20, verses 11 through 18. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Now when she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, Teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things to her. All right. Some footnotes from the Orthodox Study Bible. So for this whole passage here, verses 11 through 18, it says, the encounter between the risen Lord and Mary is reminiscent of the encounter between the bride and her beloved in the Song of Solomon. And that is Song of Solomon, chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. This parallel teaches that through the resurrection, Christ has taken the church to be his eternal bride. It also says to see the footnote at chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31 and 32, and Revelation chapter 21, verses 9 and 10. For verse 13, the term woman, it says to see the footnote at chapter 2, verses 3 through 5. I believe we may have hit that in a previous day. Could be wrong. For verse 14, it says to see the footnote at Luke chapter 24, verse 16. A lot of cross-references today. Sorry about that, guys. And for verse 16, that Mary turned again, see verse 14, shows she had been looking back and forth between the angels, verse 12, and her Lord, sensing the awe of the angels in the presence of their ruler, but not yet recognizing Jesus herself. Through Christ calling Mary by name, her eyes and heart are opened, and she recognizes him. See chapter 10, verse 3 and 4. Rabboni is an affectionate term meaning my dear teacher. For verse 17, do not cling to me. Christ does not prohibit the teaching of his resurrected flesh. Christ does not prohibit the touching, makes more sense, of his resurrected flesh. For we commune with his flesh in the Eucharist, and he even commands Thomas to touch him, verse 27. Here, Christ is instructing Mary to understand and accept that his life is not merely continuing in the same state as before, and that he will not remain with her as he did in the past, but is pressing forward to his ascension to the Father. And in verse 18, Mary Magdalene, having remained faithful to Christ to the end, is the first person sent to proclaim the risen Lord, and thus is the first apostle of the resurrection. She is known in the church as the Apostle to the Apostles. Pretty endearing title there. Our epistle reading is from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 1, verses 11 through 19. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure, and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia, and returned again to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. All right, so we got some footnotes from the Orthodox Study Bible for verses 11. Well, we got a couple here. So for one, we have one footnote is for chapter 1, verse 11, where we started, but through chapter 2, verse 14. So quite a bit of a jaunt beyond what we read here. I'm just going to read this off anyways. If you guys want to read on further to that point in your own Bibles or apps for the context here, feel free. But yeah, for chapter 1, verse 11 through chapter 2, verse 14, the true gospel is taught by true apostles, but many declare themselves to be apostles. How can we know true apostles from false? Number 1, true apostles are called by God. They learn the gospel by revelation, either directly from the risen Son, as did the original apostles, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, or by the revelation of the apostolic tradition, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. They are called by grace, not according to works or a proper background, chapter 1, verses 13 through 17. A true apostle brings glory to God, not to himself, chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. Number 2, true apostles form one church government, holding the same doctrine and working by agreement reached in council. That's chapter 2, verses 6 through 10. And number 3, true apostles stand firm in matters of conscience and are correctable when mistaken. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Thus, Paul rebukes Peter sharply in public for his hypocritical ethnic elitism. All right, now going back to our passage today. So, chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. Apostolic tradition is grounded in divine revelation from Jesus Christ. Just as the 12 were called by Christ, so was Paul. See verse 1. Just as the 12 received the gospel directly from Christ, so did Paul. See Acts chapter 9, verse 3 through 6, and chapter 26, verses 13 through 18. Just as the 12 stood together as one, so Paul entered their unity in consensus and mutual submission. And for verses 13 through 17. People are called by God not according to former conduct, in verse 13, good or bad, but by God's grace. See verse 15. Paul, whom God called in mercy, received grace from Ananias' hands in the waters of baptism. That is in Acts chapter 9, verses 10 through 19. For the phrase, separated me from my mother's womb, in verse 15, it refers not to Paul's physical birth, but to God's calling Paul to apostolic ministry before he was born. A lot of footnotes for this. See Psalm 138, verse 15 and 16, Isaiah chapter 49, verse 1, Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, Luke chapter 1, verse 35, 43, 44, and 48. As with Paul, God's intentions for a person may lie hidden for years. For verses 18 through 20, so just one more verse past what we read today. As a true apostle, Paul submits himself to the church and her apostles rather than elevating himself. Paul knows his encounter with Christ, instruction in the gospel, and call to apostleship are highly unusual. In a private revelation, the only other witness is God, is verse 20. But he also knows he must teach the same gospel as the other apostles. And for verse 19, James is James the Just, the first bishop of Jerusalem and author of the Epistle of James. Brother also means cousin or close relation. And it says to see the introduction to the Epistle of James, which I'm sure we'll try to find a point to read and get to at some point. And I don't know for sure, but I'm going to assume that this passage here today with the little mention of James was probably picked because we do venerate James, the brother of Christ today. I could be wrong about that, but I do know he is in fact venerated today. The liturgical gospel reading for today is from the book of Luke, chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, I hope that is pronounced right, which is opposite of Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. And he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For it had often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles. And he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain. So they begged him that he would permit them to enter them, and he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what happened, and came to Jesus, and found the man whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. They also had seen it told them by what means he who had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your own house, and tell what great things God has done for you." And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. All right, one of my favorite stories in the New Testament, honestly. Absolutely crazy how the demons recognized him immediately. And in driving the demons out of this man, like, they went by some pigs that were nearby and essentially committed suicide off this cliff. They were just so not willing to deal with whatever Christ, the God-man, had in store for him. A lot of esoteric stuff going on in this story. Just my personal addition there that I've always been drawn to this story. So let's get into it with the Orthodox Bible study notes. So for chapter 26 through 39, basically this whole passage that we just read now, it just says to see the footnote on Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34. I'm not going to flip to that, but maybe in your own Bibles or apps, you can double back on that verse as well. I imagine it's just an account of the same story. We'll have to see. For verse 33, some teach that the presence of swine indicates a Gentile population. However, since our Lord forbade his disciples to go to the Gentiles in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5, and was himself reluctant to seek out the Gentiles in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, likely these were Jews engaged in a sinful occupation. Interesting. And for that it says to see also the footnote at Matthew chapter 4, verse 15. The destruction of the entire herd reveals, number one, while animals are a venerable part of creation, man is of far greater value. Number two, Christ removes a source of sin, for swine herding was an abomination to the Jews. See Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 8. Number three, demons have no power over creation, but are subject to the will of God. They could only enter the swine at Christ's command. Number four, people are protected under God's providence. Otherwise, the demon-possessed man would have come to the same end as the swine. And number five, the magnitude of the economic loss would remain as a sign for the hard-hearted people who fled that region, in verse 34. And that's going to do it for today, everybody. Hope you have a blessed and pious Sunday. Hope you are or were able to really get in the zone at liturgy today, depending when you're listening to this. And I hope you join me for the start of the next week, tomorrow on Monday. All I ask is that you please keep me in your prayers. Thank you.